So we have, I think, as all of you, perhaps except for Dion knows, been looking at the I am statements of Jesus from the book of John. And we've paused a moment in the sort of middle of this I am statement analysis and discussion to highlight the way and the ways that God interacts with mankind. In these short declarative statements, the I am statements of Jesus, we see some of the unique and fundamental attributes of God. Because of their shortness, you might think that these statements would be straightforward and unambiguous, terse as they are. I am the bread of life, I am the light of the world, I am the door, I am the good shepherd, I am the vine, I am the way, the truth, and the life, I am the resurrection and the life. But nonetheless, in a style that we see is altogether godlike, even these short declarative statements leave the hearer wondering what actually is being said. In the 10th chapter of the book of John, as Jesus is talking about this, in verse 6, it says, "This figure of speech Jesus spoke to them, but they did not understand what those things were which he had been saying to them." So even though he was making these fairly short and pithy statements, he was at the same time apparently bringing some confusion into their mind. As we have said many times before, God, it seems, is not the answer man. God is the questioner, not the answerer. God is the thought provoker, not the settler of ideas. And why should that surprise us, given the fact that in Isaiah 55 we learn that my ways are not your ways, and that my thoughts are not your thoughts, and that the difference is not just insignificant, but is the difference between the heavens and the earth, or in essence, light years of difference between what God thinks and what man thinks. Throughout the Scriptures, when God shows up, the questions always begin. Whether it's Adam or Abraham, Moses or Elijah, the major and the minor prophets, they all find themselves under the interrogation of God, but perhaps none more so than Job, who is a case study in the technique of how God communicates with man. Job, you recall, had been plying God with questions concerning the plight he found himself in and the injustice of his undeserved suffering, at least in his mind. Can you still hear me, David?
Yes, I can hear you fine.
In chapter 38 of Job, God speaks up, and when God speaks up, again, as is always the case in the Scriptures, the questions begin. In the passages which follow from the 38th chapter on till the 42nd chapter, God asks Job more than 60 different questions. Indeed, he asked them specifically 60 questions for answers. These questions have to do with who. The questions have to do with where. Can you? Have you? Do you? These are all the form and foundation of the questions and the basis of the questions which God asks. The questions are expansive and are much rooted in the observations of the natural world. Long before science as we know it was invented, God asked Job these sort of scientific questions. But he begins with kind of a put-down of Job, which is seen in the 38th chapter, verse 1. "And the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind and said, Who is this that darkens counsel by words without knowledge?" In other words, who is talking here without knowing what they're talking about? And that, of course, was the opening salvo that God gives to Job. God then takes Job through a series of questions about the creation, questions about geography, questions about weather, questions about the animal world, in an attempt for Job to have his mind expanded in a real and meaningful way. The question brings Job to his proverbial and maybe even his literal knees in chapter 40, in chapter 42, he eventually cries uncle to God and says, "Okay, I give up." But in chapter 40, he begins the process of capitulating to God by saying, then Job answered the Lord, verse 3 of chapter 40, "Behold, I am insignificant. What can I reply to thee? I lay my hand on my mouth. Once I have spoken, and I will not answer, even twice, and will add no more." Then God is not done yet. He launches into another line of questioning centered on the power and the majesty of God. Here is God challenging Job's suppositions, which started earlier in the book. Job, it seems, knows better than God what the moral order of the world should be and what it should look like. You recall that earlier Job had threatened God with litigation in order to prove his innocence and the injustice of his suffering. In Job chapter 3, we see even more insidious viewpoint of Job when he is talking to God in verse 1 of chapter 3. Afterward, Job opened his mouth and cursed the day of his birth. And Job said, "Let the day perish on which I was to be born, and the night which said, a boy child was conceived. May that day be darkness. Let not God care for it, nor light shine on it. Let darkness and black gloom claim it. Let the cloud settle on it. Let the blackness of the day terrify it. As for that night, let darkness seize it. Let it not rejoice among the days of the year. Let it not come into the number of the months. Behold, let that night be barren." You can see, you can see here that this is an attempt by Job to do nothing less than to reverse the order of creation. God says in Genesis 1, "Let there be light." Job says here, at least as far as I'm concerned, "Let there be darkness." This desire to reverse creation, Jesus called the judgment in John chapter 3, verse 19, where he said, "And this is the judgment, that light had come into the world, and men preferred darkness rather than light, for their deeds were evil. For everyone who does evil hates the light and does not come to the light, lest his deeds should be exposed." This brings us back to a common fundamental problem that mankind has: the desire to reverse the creation, the desire of mankind to be the creator rather than the creature. As I mentioned, this is what Jesus refers to as the judgment. But this brings us back again to the communication methods that God uses with mankind. Questions, it seems, form the foundation of the style, but even the short declarative statements that Jesus uses need interpretation. Sometimes I wonder why God can't be like us and just say what he means and mean what he says. What is it about the questions? What is it about the riddles? Why the parables that are such an important part of the communication of God to man? In Matthew 13, we see that this same method and style is employed not only by God but by Jesus as well. In verse 34 of Matthew 13, "All these things Jesus spoke to the multitudes in parables. and he did not speak to them without a parable, so that it was spoken through the prophet, so that what was spoken through the prophet might be fulfilled, saying, I will open my mouth in parables, I will utter things hidden since the foundation of the world. Jason's a teacher. Why doesn't God just teach? Why does he continually have to delve into this business of questions, riddles, and parables? Is it possible that these methods of God's communication with man is designed to open the gaps which we were speaking about last week, that even if the God of the gap theory is a faulty one, that is to say that God can be found not just in the gaps, but can be found in the natural world as we know it, and as it exists. Paul says in Romans chapter 1, you recall that the invisible things of God were made manifest by his creation, verse 20 of Romans 1, for since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood what has been made. So we see God can be seen not only in in the gaps, but also in nature itself. And yet there is a truth to the subject that we were dealing with last week, and that is that we do tend to worship what we find mysterious. Things that we don't understand tend to be objects of veneration. And I wonder if in God's method here, one of the things that may be operative is that he keeps reopening, reforming these gaps in order that we continue to seek after him. We see again in the story of Job, over and over, the questions of science. Who measures the earth? Notice that in the measurement of the earth is not a round object. It's not entirely round. It's longer on one axis than it is on another axis. There's reasons for that have to do with how things accumulate, how particularly liquids accumulate at the center axis of a spinning sphere. He talks about how the creation occurs, how the stars in the universe is kept in order. This seeking to expand the mind seems to be a characteristic feature of the way in which God communicates with mankind. And I'm wondering, what are your thoughts about this? David has offered, as you know, to rewrite the Bible and try to get God on the right plane. I'm asking for some thoughts this morning as to why do you think God seeks to communicate with mankind in such a obtuse way, as I said, with parable, with riddle, with questions. Rarely, even as I said earlier, the short declarative statement, I am this, I am that, requires some interpretation, some understanding, some context, and so forth. What are your thoughts about the way God communicates with man and the importance of God's techniques in doing that?